Hey everyone, we're back with more World Eaters, and this week all I managed to get done was the battle damage on my Dreadnaught. And I thought, well, actually, battle damage is something that we should probably go into more detail with in terms of discussion because, every Horus Heresy tutorial we're putting out, there's going to be some battle damage on it. So I wanted to just spend a little bit longer than usual and discuss quite a few different options. And my personal view on battle damage is to have multiple layers of different types and then just all these different layers of detail add up to lots of information on the model and it looks really cool. If you've watched any heresy video from me before, you know I'm fixated and fascinated by the Forge World colour plates. And when I first sort of got into the hobby, I was like, wow, these look so cool. And I couldn't really work out because I was new to the hobby why. And it's just because they have so much information and detail going on. When we've done the highlights and the rendering, we've seen how much contrast they put on the colour plates, especially when I looked at doing the Sons of Horus in those previous tutorials. But as well as that, there's lots of texture, and this texture comes from different things. Sometimes they do the armour and it has a kind of mottled effect, but mostly it's from lots of kind of weathering effects and chipping. The World Eaters, of course, are known for getting stuck in there and being covered in blood, but underneath that blood there should be other types of weathering and effects going on as well. So I really like this colour plate because it's the red and white, which is what I've chosen to go for. And, I barely noticed that it had the fast attack arrow symbol on the shoulder because it was so worn out and weathered. So I don't know if that's a faded symbol or it's covered in blood, but there's just so much going on. And there's the markings, of course, which is probably going to be his kill count. So yeah, I just wanted to go through different types of chips, some ways to do it, and how layering up all these multiple effects can make something pretty cool in the end. So I managed to paint the black on the Dreadnaught, which was, it took ages to be honest. Not as bad as I thought it was going to be, but I broke down the model into quite a few parts just so it was easier to block in the black. So I barely glued mine together so I could break it apart if I needed to. And as it's white, I felt I needed it too so I could be nice and accurate. After this, the first thing I wanted to do was shade the white, and I thought, well, we might as well give these new shades a go. And I have to say, I really like this one because I was wondering what should I do to shade the white, and I don't own a specific oil paint that I love. So what I was doing previously was just mixing some black and white. I find the Payne's grey, which a lot of people use, to be too blue, but this is absolutely fantastic. So yeah, it's very warm and it wasn't dark enough for some areas, but certainly for the sort of almost pure white sections, I found this to be really nice. It's worth noting I do have the mini glossed up, so of course it runs into the recesses easier right now, but if you make a mistake as well, you can wipe it off. Although with the amount of weathering we're going to do, yeah, you can't really do many mistakes at this point, even though it's on white. I did the blocking out of the black first because it saves kind of doubling down on jobs. So where I've blocked in the black, obviously I don't need to give it a recess wash, but the recess wash was great where I needed something softer than black, such as around the rivets and all those little sections. So that's the reason I did it and painted the black first. After this step, I gave a fairly thick gloss varnish on the entire model, and this is really important to make sure you don't get misting on the transfers, which actually I've experienced a couple times recently, but it also seals in the black and the wash so they won't rub off. It just gives a nice layer of protection. I'm not going to gloss varnish the model again after this point, as I'll probably be doing some metallics and things like that later. I then want to AK Ultra Matte the whole thing, and this is the finish I want for my figure. You can see how beautiful and rich the red is as it's glossy, and this is going to dull the red right down. So you do have to decide if you want your colours to be quite dull. Personally, I do, and at the moment I'm really enjoying the look of a very matte looking model. But it's just something you need to be aware of. If you want something to be matte, then you can't get the colours as rich. But personally, I think for Heresy, this is a really nice aesthetic to go for, and it's going to make our metallics look really nice later over the ultra matte. You can see what a huge difference that's made. The red though, even though it's really matte and not as rich, I think looks beautiful, and personally I prefer the look of it matte. And the decals have come out really good. I previously skipped gloss varnishing them, and yeah, you can't skip that is what I learned, because I don't think it seals in the micro set or something. But anyway, let's get on with the battle damage. So here I'm going in with Burnt Umber from scale 75. Now the brown you use is really up to you. I like Burnt Umber because it's a colder brown, a bit more neutral than something like Rhinox Hide, which has more red in it. There's a bunch of different browns you could use, and I actually think having a different brown throughout one model is a cool thing to do, because it can represent different age chips. Older ones could maybe have more orange in, and fresher ones could be lighter, things like that. I'm starting with the front here because I think it's kind of the focal point, and you can see I'm using a 2-0 brush and just being very careful. I think it's important to start with the leading edges, so for sure pretty much all the edges on this Dreadnaught I want to have damage, and that's to kind of replace edge highlighting. I think if it's a corner, most of the paint is going to chip off, and I kind of can use a almost like a dry brush technique, but really I'm just using the side of the brush to carefully chip the edges. And I need to vary some bigger chips with really fine lines where it's just worn away a little bit. You can use the hairspray technique, but over years of trying that a bunch of times, I still think I prefer the control of just using a brush. And this is why I wanted to do this video, is have longer clips as opposed to just saying do the battle damage, and just show a bit more real time, and yeah, just talk a little bit more about why I like to do battle damage in certain ways. You can see I'm really working on the corner here because I think that's a priority, and I'm just using a little bit of the side of the brush to catch certain areas. You know, the better you get at this, you can do it quite quickly, but I think with Heresy, this is where you should spend the time. I'm not doing edge highlights, I'm not doing loads and loads of detail, and the airbrushing didn't take too long to get the main colours down, so I think this is the time really to get your detail in, and building up lots of different layers of chips like this is going to put loads of information on this relatively plain looking white, and I think that's how we can make it look cool. I do think it's good with battle damage to do a little bit, take a step back, and look at how much you've done, because you can often do too much or too little. So yeah, just try and take a step back and see how things are looking from the far view every now and again. Now I do that same side brush technique, and this is a big, another focal area because it's where the Contemptor Dreadnaught shifts and we have that armor panel facing down. So we've separated the two already by airbrushing the dark on the bottom, but I think because it's such a, it's facing forward, the front of the Dreadnaught, I pretty much want all of that to have damage on it. So yeah, this again is why we don't need to edge highlight, because all of this lead facing edge I want to be chipped away. So I start by doing that thin line, and then I add just some random chips. Random's actually really hard to do. You can see already I've kind of done 3 chips and they're all evenly spaced, like 2mm apart. So you've got to be really conscious of doing that. So try and have some areas of relief as well. So you can have some parts with absolutely tons of damage, then have some space maybe around the side where it wouldn't see much damage, leave that blank. And it's really about weighting the areas that would naturally get more damage. And I'm starting with the front here because I think he would get loads of damage at the front, and then at the back and the sides I'm going to have slightly less. A lot of people will say that Space Marine armor is some kind of ceramite, I think, so actually you wouldn't get rust or this kind of brown chipping that I've done. Personally, I don't really care about that because I think the brown chipping is really cool, but I actually like to do chips that are the same colour of the armour as well, because they can represent more subtle light scratches as opposed to older, deeper ones that have rusted or turned brown or whatever. So for this, I'm actually just using the white grey in the highlights, and that means it is visible because when we airbrush it, it's not as dense, so it will kind of subtly show up. But in the shadow parts, this is going to be too bright, so I do need to vary the highlight colour, and I'll just use that medium grey, which was kind of the mid-tone in the other areas, and it will show up better in the shadowed areas. But I think it's nice to, have some little chips and white and things like that. When you airbrush something, obviously it's very smooth, it's very clean, and I think it can look really sterile. If that's a look you like, having it super clean, then that's fair enough. But I like things to have a lot of interest and texture and stuff like that. So this is one of the more subtle ones that actually from afar I really don't want to be seen. But as you come up close, then it's nice to have something to look at and just break up the relentless kind of grey, essentially. I mean, we're adding more grey, so maybe that's wrong. But it's going back to those colour plates, what I mentioned about having lots of mottled texture and stuff going on. So I just think the more the merrier with this kind of chipping. We can do the same process with the red. The red's looking rather stunning there, I think, thanks to the airbrushing. And I love just having the top panel as kind of the bright part, but no sort of rendering of each individual part. It's just as it changes angle, then we get those different variations in the red. So I'm just doing the same thing as the white here with the burnt umber, and it doesn't show up very well on the red, but again, I don't mind that. Of course, it's more consistent if we use the same chipping colour. You could say if I used a different brown, it would be more visible, but I'm really happy for it to be more subtle on the red. Personally, I quite like it that you can just about see it on the corners, again, instead of the edge highlights. To break these up even further, I'm going to add some Iron Warriors, so some silver, as if it's really gone down right to the metal or whatever, or to represent fresher chips. So I did the brown along the entire edge, then I just pick random parts, maybe where the brown is bigger, to add the silver. I'm adding it now, and I'm probably going to matte varnish this, which will dull the silver down, and then I'll add further depth by reapplying the silver. So we have all these different coloured chips, and then I'm even going to have some matter ones and some shinier ones with the silver. So all these things might not be too obvious, and people might not know the sort of amount of effort you've put into the chipping and varnishing it at various stages, but you'll know it's there, and it will look cool and is worthwhile overall, as opposed to just doing one colour chipping all over. I blocked in the rivets just so I could get a better overall view of the pad and how it's looking. And like we did on the white and added some of the kind of the grey chips, I'm also going to do the same with the red. So I think this red I'm using is maybe a little bit bright for this very shadowed part here, but it certainly demonstrates what I'm talking about, and just having all these different types of chips and layering and things like that. It looks really cool on the highlight part because it's a bit more subtle. This is something that requires practice and a little bit of finesse, just understanding how much chipping to do. And you probably will do some figures where you go overboard or you don't do enough because you're a little bit reserved about doing it. And over time, you'll you'll just get to grips with it. But I think the main thing is to just not do it even all over different parts. Start with where you think, okay, this is definitely going to get the most chipping, whether it be the edge or the front, and then just gradually add it slowly. You can see I haven't done loads to the front, and I'll actually come back to that. So I tend to rotate around the model, and it's not the most efficient way of doing it. So maybe if you're doing an army, you'll just chip the whole thing and come back to it. But I think this is just the way I like to do it, because you can take a step back and decide to add more, but it's more difficult to take the damage away once you've done it, of course. I hope you can really see at this point how the multiple levels of chips is really adding up to a great overall look that's full of detail and information. I start to work on the legs, and of course I go through exactly the same thing, but I thought it would be good to just reiterate a few things. So here I've got very little paint on the brush, and I'm kind of dry brushing, but I'm trying to just catch the edge and then do little flicks of the brush to get lines and scratches. But yeah, the first thing I focus on is the edges. So I just use that side brush and really gently rub that. The good thing about using the burnt umber is it's got this nice translucency. So if you carefully rub quite a lot of it off the brush, you can get some nice subtle chips. And if you have your brush loaded with a lot of paint, then you can do deeper chips. But you can see where I'm just catching this edge, it is fairly subtle, and it's fairly fine as well. It's probably better than I could do edge highlights, but it's easier than edge highlights, of course, because if you make a mistake, then, well, it's damage. So it's a really wonderful way of painting. Edge highlighting, when done well, does look amazing, but it's difficult. It's time consuming. And I still think you should take a lot of time doing damage, but it's certainly easier than edge highlighting. I didn't notice my camera ran out of battery, but I managed to not grab me painting this hand detail, which is of course from the red butcher artwork. But yeah, I'm using burnt red here, and that's to differentiate from the red we've painted on the shoulders. And also later I'm going to add some fresh blood, probably just with blood for the blood god or some Tamiya clear. But I wanted there to be some old dried blood on this. So I'm going to do the old dried blood in this video, and then we'll finish the figure in the final part by doing some fresh blood. This is very much the same thing. You can see I'm adding little dots and chips here. Later I'm going to use the airbrush, to be honest, as this is quite time consuming. But if you want to be reserved with your blood, then you can just add it on in the same way. Here you can see I've added a bunch more, and I'm just building up the thickness on the hand. A while ago, David Soper did a small tutorial, and it was basically doing verdigris effects, where you put a blob of very diluted paint, and halfway through drying you actually wick away the centre of that paint, and then you get that sort of stain like watermarks, but it's basically where the paint pigment sticks around the edge of the drying water, and it looks very unpleasant in a normal situation, but I think for creating these kind of blood stains, it looks really, really cool. I saw it in that Red Butcher artwork, and then I just remembered David doing that tutorial with the verdigris and thought, yeah, let's do that with some blood. Looking back at the artworks I'm using, I realise I need a kind of fine mist, as it's just a little jarring having this blood. So I go back to my airbrush and I really heavily dilute the burnt red, and I just do a very translucent, almost a glaze, but yeah, I'm basically just doing a thin airbrush over the front here. And you can almost spray the airbrush from below as if it's a dead body, splattering upwards, and then you'll cover the right areas. I do think I went a bit over the top with this, and actually I think it would have been better if I weighted it on one leg more than the other. So I ended up having a very symmetrical amount of blood, and I think I should have gone really heavy on one leg as if he stamped someone, and just gone a little bit lighter on the other. Again, that goes back to the weathering point where I said don't make things even, and have areas of relief. So yeah, one leg bloodier than the other certainly would have been cooler, but I'm just having a great time. This is certainly probably not going to be to everyone's taste, but I'm just doing this model for fun, and World Eaters, are known for the blood. I've heard lots of people, including myself actually, saying people go over the top with the blood, but yeah, I'm doing it. Why not? Let's just get some blood on there. You can see I'm still taking my time with the airbrushing, but it's making a big difference, and it definitely makes the thicker bits of blood, like the hand, less jarring, as it almost fades it into the white. So yeah, I'm happy with it at this point. Normally when I airbrush, I push the trigger all the way down, which is the air, and then pull it back slowly to release the paint. But if we pull it all the way back and then just tap down, then this is basically all air and very little paint. And then you can make it splat on purpose. This is very tricky to control, but with some practice, I think you can get some quite convincing effects. So basically pull the trigger all the way back without pressing it down, and then slowly pulse and press it down a little bit, and you should start to get little, splots and sprays and things like that. So make sure you don't really care about your Mini. Obviously I was having fun and experimenting, but yeah, I found this once I got to grips with a few practices on the trigger to be pretty fine to do, and this helped me do a really nice kind of misty splatty effect on the fists. And again, it's quite good to introduce the blood, and then I'll go in with the brush and do some controlled dots. And you can really vary this. Like if you're really heavy on how you do this effect, you get proper blobs, but somewhere sort of halfway in between is pretty cool. I realised, of course, I needed to paint the metallics on the front of the legs before carrying on with any more blood effects. So I'd actually ran out of time at this point and hadn't finished all the damage. So I think this is a nice point to leave this part. And then the final part will be doing the metallics and the oil paints and the base. So that should wrap things up nicely. I'm really happy with how it's looking. It's a little bit over the top on the legs, I will admit. Like I said, if it was just on one leg, I think that would have been cooler. But I'm really happy with how the blood misting with the airbrush is looking on the fists. So yeah, that was really cool. I think once I have the dead marine on the base and I add a bit of gore to that, it'll be less jarring and make a bit more sense, and that should help with it not looking super over the top. I'm glad that I got to talk a little more detail about my chipping process at the moment. Normally it might be a 1 or 2 minute clip of chipping, and I managed to talk about battle damage for 20 minutes. So I hope you enjoyed this, and for some of you who maybe were struggling with battle damage, it helps. Or maybe if you're pretty confident with battle damage, adding those extra layers and different depths of battle damage makes your stuff look even better. I definitely think if you do the 3 basic levels of brown chips, the same color as your armor scratches, and some really deep metallic or silver chips, you have those 3 different levels, and it'll be way more interesting. I really encourage you to take your time with your battle damage and just enjoy it. For me, it's the reason I like to paint Heresy, and I've tried a lot of different methods over the years, and I think my preference is basically going in with a detail brush and taking my time with it. I do love the hairspray technique, it's amazing and realistic, but my preference is the way we've done in this video. I might do a video in a few years' time and I'm loving the hairspray technique, but for now, this is what I'm enjoying. So I look forward to the final part, and we'll finish this Dreadnaught with some metallics, some oil paints, and definitely a lot more blood. So until then, I'll see you next time.